Hi everyone, I'm Giovanna Borazzi, Director of CCA, and I welcome you in this virtual space we will all share while being safely distant. This is an experiment for CCA. We have ahead of us about an hour of ideas, questions, and in certain cases, even some risky prediction of how the future might look like. We're living in an epochal moment where the pandemic and all its connected crises and effects on finance, ecology, and society at large clearly reveal the failures and compromises embedded in our system, and in many cases also the inequity of it. We're also witnessing how in this time of lockdown, architecture and urbanism have been central to keep us safe, though only for those who have actually a home. But isolation can also be dangerous, and we need to think about it differently. For now, in recent months, cities are becoming again the backdrop of unheard voices to speak. We think that brave and inventive architectural thinking will be even more crucial in the future. To establish frameworks for others to inhabit, to suggest new societal models, to understand how we will live together. Last year, we published a book that explained the CCA mind and critically calls for redefining museums' roles, and that is titled, "The Museum is Not Enough." So ironically, we took the same phrasing to challenge now the idea of individualism that is more and more pervasive in today's society, at least in Western culture, and that has even increased in this pandemic time. We're taking this time to observe, question, think, and also ask on what should be next. In a moment that is noisy with reflection, with everybody trying to understand what is happening and what it means, the following is a sample of how CCA thinks around contemporary issues, always trying to be inclusive and searching for questions raised by other cultures or in other geographies. Before we begin, please remember that the chat is always on. We look forward to your reaction, your question and comments, your curiosity and confusion about what we have prepared for you. I will be in the chat along with others from the CCA to respond. Have a great time.
この建物は都市で住む8人の人が8部屋で構成された家です。家というか集合住宅、要するにマンションとかアパートのような集合住宅でもなくて、一戸建ての家とも違う、今までとは全く違った新しいタイプの住宅というのを考えています。でそれぞれ都市で一人暮らしをしている人は若い人もお年寄りも結構たくさん増えていますけれども、そういう人を想定しています。でそういう一人暮らしをしている人っていうのはずっと家にいるわけではなくて、都市のいろんな場所を行くわけです。公園に行ったり、電車の中が自分の家のように感じたり、カフェだったり大学だったり、図書館だったり会社だったりいろいろあると思うんです。でそういう人たちが家に求めることっていうのもたくさんあるんですね。いろんな仕事をしている人もいますから。でそういう人たちが例えば家に帰るときに、全部揃ってる家ではなくて、その自分の好きな部分だけがあればいいんじゃないかということで、例えばお風呂しかない家ですとか、キッチンしかない家だとか、日当たりがいいだけの家で他は何もないとか、そういうような部分がいっぱい集まってるような家です。でみんな部分しか持っていないので、例えばお風呂しか持ってない部屋の人っていうのは、ご飯食べたいときはキッチンの部屋の人に訪れたり、逆もあったりして、そうしていくうちにみんなその自分の不足を求めてですね、それぞれが魅力的なので行きたくなってくるわけで、そうすると人が集まってきて、 知らない人たちが一個の家に集まって新しい家族みたいなものになる、そういうような建物を考えました。はい。
What you have just saw are few moments of the new documentary produced by the CCA entitled On My Own. I have visited several times myself this house in Tokyo and really dreamt of living in it. The architect Ippei project is quite radical, beside the visible extreme tightness of the spaces. This concept really tries to respond to what is the contemporary life of a young urban person living alone. Living alone today is very different. The perception and the idea of loneliness and collectivity has radically changed. Together apart is understood as the new normal. Ippei proposes a new idea of expanded domesticity, where the city at large is becoming your home. And also with his projects, induce you to talk to your neighbor, as you will certainly miss more than sugar in your space. More and more people globally live alone. And us at the CCA, we're wondering, what form will have this new city in the future? More individualized or the opposite, more connected? Ce documentaire fait partie d'une trilogie de films que nous réalisons pour nous concentrer sur la façon dont les nouveaux changements sociétaux affectent la ville. Nous nous concentrons sur les populations ou les conditions qui augmentent à l'échelle mondiale et qui, en fin de compte, nécessiteront une réimagination radicale de ce qu'est une maison et de qu'est-ce que c'est la ville. Les sans-abri, les personnes seules et les personnes âgées sont nos trois sujets principaux, et en particulier la façon dont les architectes fournissent des idées pour des meilleures solutions. Toutes ces recherches sont menées sous forme de documentaires, car nous pensons que c'est le bon moyen de représenter la complexité de cette question. De plus, grâce à la connexion émotionnelle que le film peut établir avec le spectateur, nous sommes en mesure de toucher un public plus large. Stay tuned for the next episodes.
This is Kayoko Ota reporting from Tokyo. One thing that's particular to Japan is that the country is constantly facing the risk of natural disasters. Now we're approaching the rainy season, June, so we have to prepare for storm, flood, and landslide in addition to earthquake. In the previous normal, a large number of refugees used to gather in one big space and spend days together, but that is obviously no longer possible. So how can we survive a refugee condition is a big concern to everyone now. We're all fearing that no municipality has been prepared for the next big disaster. But one positive thing is that, as usual, the architect Shigeru Ban was very quick to move. Immediately after Japan entered a mild lockdown in the mid-April, he devised a system of sheltering homeless people individually, which is a partition unit made of paper pipes and curtains. He consulted with an epidemiologist to define the specs and also devised a way of seaming curtains airtight. So now 90 units are already installed and used in a public gym in Yokohama City. And I think that this kind of action is needed in all parts of the country. The tourism industry has been severely hit under the stay-home regime. Some innkeepers have invented remote tourist programs. I think that is not only Japan, but for instance, you can visit an inn in a remote countryside, and the innkeeper will navigate you to the charms and hidden places in the area all online. With such a program, you get to know and enjoy what you would have never have come across before. You have probably seen this crazy scene of Japanese trains literally packed with businessmen and businesswomen. When Tokyo went under the stay-home regime, the craziness finally calmed down after maybe 100 years. According to a recent survey, more than 60% of workers in Tokyo have adopted a remote work system, which is amazing. Trains used to be packed because of the commuters' strong loyalty to companies or organizations that they belong to. And most organizations have tried to be in the city center and made everyone be together at the same time. But this tradition and even the value system of the whole society was suddenly forcibly terminated. I think the physical new order of social distance will inevitably shift the mind of people and the society's value altogether into decentralization or localization. The heavy concentration in the urban core, which supported the economic rise of Tokyo and also Japan for the past 75 years at least, is finally making a turn.
Hola, this is Martin Huberman reporting from Buenos Aires. Most fundamental change was a political change. As in many other countries around the world for the past years, confrontation and bipartisanism has been a motto for the political scene, which ended up leaking into social conduct. So there was a lot of confrontation in the streets, and the idea of this invisible enemy that has to be fought before anything else has built a consensus in between politicians from different parties towards finding common solutions to different problems. And I believe that this scenario enhanced the idea that this is not a drill, and empowered a social conscience towards respecting the rules, something that is not very common in this latitude. It has really led us to all to play together with the same set of rules and try to get along, which was pretty refreshing after, I think, 15 years of political and social confrontation. The pandemic has created both little differences in our daily life, like in our ordinary life, and then big changes in our daily life. The notion of going to work to make the work has completely disappeared, and that will have a repercussion on the architecture of work. For example, my wife's company, we're building a new building to really get all the small businesses together in the same building. And now I know that they are rethinking that idea, because they understood that they don't need all their employees to be working on the same place. On the positive side, I believe that this scenario might work as an accelerator for things that were already happening in the city, where the old model of apartment buildings with amenities being developed by the market or by architecture through the lens of speculative interests is starting to find the end of the road, while new generations are finding in architecture a possible ally to produce new housing strategies that are self-sufficient, where the home is linked to the idea of self-care, and where the house and the idea of living together is linked to an idea of how we produce the building itself. The idea of sharing some assets of the house might be part of single solutions for the future.
This is Doreen Adengo. I'm reporting from Kampala. What we've experienced that's unique to us is that there's been the threat of Ebola coming across from Congo about 3 times, and 3 times the government has been able to respond quickly. And so what that means is the average person, first of all, is not panicked over this. The idea of the threat of a disease is not new to us. And then the government has been very quick in responding to this particular issue by introducing a quarantine at the airport and closing down the borders really fast, and eventually leading to the lockdown that we're in. Another thing that's unique to us is that lockdown has kind of landed almost as an idea that is very hard for the average person to wrap their minds around, because we live communally and we think collectively, especially during a time of crisis. So the idea of being alone is just, it hasn't happened in our lockdown. Initially, it was a 21-day lockdown that was increased by 14 days. And then it was actually lifted as of yesterday, the 26th. And I think a lot of that pressure for the government to lift this was, for one, a lot of people, most of the food is fresh, so we can't stock up. Another reason that it's been hard to stock up is a lot of people live from day to day. And so it necessitated us to constantly have to go out to find stuff. And so the lockdown hasn't happened in I guess what I put a scientific way. There's actually been a lot of communal efforts in order to get through this phase. My personal experience in lockdown is my office is located in the Central Business District, and I always sourced a lot of my necessities and services around the office. And I live in a different place, a hill called Mutungo. And in the lockdown, because of being, we're now all working from home, I've been sourcing everything around home. And so I've actually gotten to know the fresh market in the neighborhood. I've gotten to know who my neighbors are, or even just walking back and forth, meeting people much more. And the general sense I get is everyone is relieved not to have to commute into the center of the city every day. I anticipate that even when the lockdown's lifted up, a lot of people try to think of ways to stay in their neighborhoods. And so there'll be a general decentralization, and not everyone trying to get into the center at the same time. On a serious note, it's been really hard for people that live from day to day, like hand to mouth, and have to, they've been earning their income informally and suddenly just can't earn an income. And I think that's been really difficult and particularly challenging. They said only the formal markets can work, and the women that kind of are not quite formal had to stop. And it was really difficult. How do you enforce that? Because how would they live if they don't have? So that's kind of where it's the informal businesses versus the people with the formal source of income. Yeah. But again, because of the topography plays into it, every hill, the higher you go, the more wealthy. The lower you go, the informal settlements. So the two types of groups of people are not separate. It's not like one group is over here and the other group's over there. We're all interacting with each other, because you have to go from one hill, go down to the next, so there's and then the markets are usually towards the bottom of the hill. So I think geographically and when you navigate, going around the city, there's mixing, but I think it's around the source of income.
I am Guido Beltramini. I'm reporting from Vicenza in the northeast of Italy. We have been the first European country to be infected by the virus. But in my region, the northeast of Italy, we were able to perform very well in order to keep our people safe from the virus as much as possible. One reason, I think, is a tight alliance between political power and local universities. They create together a situation room that works very efficiently. However, architecture, I think, was the key factor in our success in the resistance against the virus, but not a real architecture, but the architecture of our health system. The Veneto is a polycentric region with many small and medium-sized cities like Venice, Padua, Verona, or Vicenza. And here, the architecture of our health system is based on a network of small hospitals, each of them very specialized on a specific problem. And more important, the health system is based on a very strong network of family doctors. I think that one of the effects, maybe the most important effect of this pandemic, is the idea of how important is a national public health system. Because you know that the Veneto region performed very well for this network of family doctors. Our neighbor, the Lombardy region, they have a completely different architecture of the health system based on huge hospitals, and they not destroyed, but they don't have a so strong network of family doctors. And the effect was the opposite, because people went to the hospitals in Lombardy, and in the hospital, they were infected by the virus. And here, you stay in your home, and the family doctors give you instructions, keep you at home as long as possible. And so this completely changed the situation. And this idea, this is a pride of, there is a pride of the national health system and the public system, because in Lombardy is mostly private, with links with the public system, obviously, but private. In the Veneto is public, and the public system worked better.
You know, that's precisely why it's useful to think about architecture more collectively, right? Because then you can carve out different kinds of spaces in one, let's say, building, right? So you can have, theoretically, you can have a desk in another zone, right? Just, it would be really nice, I think, for a lot of people if they had an office space, like a little working space that could also be a playing space on another floor, right? I mean, it's a really simple example, but just the, you know, just to think about getting rid of the castle notion of a house, right? Like the fortress nature of it, where it's like everything's in or everything's out. I think just the sharing thing, but forget about sharing just for a second, just like dividing program a little bit, just spreading things out a little bit in a given building, or in a given, so that you could have like a, let's say, a dining room or a kitchen with one family next door, but everybody could have their office on the roof, and everybody could have, there can certainly be like a playroom for multiple people somewhere else. That space in total is the same as square footage, but in use is multiples larger. It's like you're outsourcing a little bit of privacy, and you're getting more back, right? I mean, it's a very good trade, right? So it's like, I used to live in Moriyama House, which is a really great example by Nishizawa. And it really, you know, it's the smallest room I've ever lived in on paper by a lot. I mean, it's, you know, I think you could fit my room, at least 10 of them, inside my current apartment. The whole house. I mean, but you could fit the whole house in my current apartment. But just the one room that I had a giant door onto the street, right? And that giant door onto the street made it so that the street was always like also in my house, but my house was also the street, right? But the stream is way bigger than my house. You get more if you divide and share and use things over time in different ways. I mean, I'm really convinced about that. It's really, really hard to convince other people though, like who are, when they're like writing checks, just to say, I try. We're working on 2 projects that are kind of, I would say, collective housing. One's in the Rockaways in New York, and one's here in Berlin. It's 26 units here, and the other one's 6 bedrooms. The one here, land was very inexpensive at a moment, right? So that's the first thing, right? It didn't have a time pressure in the same way because of the cost of the land. So that's the first thing. Like you still need to build in that flexibility. And the other thing you do to convince people is you say, okay, well, we're by collectivizing this, we're cutting out some middlemen, right? We're cutting out anybody else who's going to make money off of this by virtue of you caring about your own house. And that's such a cool thing that it never works with investors. You have to have people who want to live that way, right? And, you know, sure, they're investing, but I never call them my investors. I call them my clients and future neighbors, right? I mean, you really got to talk to people like, this is your life, right? And it's I haven't figured out a way to do it with, you know, with somebody who wants to do it speculatively. Although people talk about it with me from time to time, but I've never gotten it off the ground like as a speculative project. But maybe that's just me. I think somebody better with numbers maybe could. I tend to try to convince people that, like, no, your life's going to be better like this. And so in every case, everybody who's paying is living there in all those projects, in every project that I work on. How about even more micro? How about like just tables, right? And like how we cook. And, you know, I have a problem that all architects have, which is that architecture takes too long. And yet I'm really interested in this sort of larger question that you're asking about collectivity. And I, you know, in a lot of our work, like literally half the projects right now are about sort of rethinking the way the Bauhaus has made kitchens in lines into people cooking together, people coming together in really small scales, which somehow slowly starts to scale up, I think, to like the macro idea of collectivity, right? Like, let's say, as an American, just the collective idea of being a Democrat or even more a socialist, right? Like it helps for me all the time to toggle between those scales, right? So to go from like just, for example, a stove, right? Like a stove, we make stoves that are circles so that everybody by default stands around it, right? It's kind of a straightforward thing, but that helps also convince clients and whatever the collective future is, to do it in the case of their apartments, right? In the case of their housing, in the case of their, you know, collective communities. I'd like people to just be less afraid of it. That's the main thing. I mean, and maybe this is a boring way to like shift the conversation, but of course, it's always about money very, very quickly, right? And it's such a painful thing to talk to clients and people who are really willing to think collectively, but then how do you invest collectively? How do you collectivize profits? How do you collect, you know, real estate has become more currency than place to be, right? I mean, the place to be-ness of it is ever smaller, and like the fact that you can resell it is ever bigger. So I guess in the future, I would love real estate to be worth less, despite owning quite a bit. I would like it to just kind of crash, and maybe we don't have to live in cities, and then cities become incredibly inexpensive anew, and then the countryside starts. You can start thinking about collective things where every square foot or square meter is not in fact like your investment portfolio, right? Because that makes it so much easier to share and not worry about it. right? Because sharing by default or collectivizing is somewhat experimental. For a post-COVID society, I want to invite more people to live with me, right? I want to, I've just spent, I have a 6 month, no, now an 8-month-old baby and a lovely wife, and we have like a little nuclear family. And it's been great, but what I want in a new post-COVID world is like a much broader set of connections that don't feel so insular, right? So, and it will do that. I mean, that's what I'm going to do in a post-COVID society. I'm going to start to invite more people over. I'm going to send my daughter, my tiny baby daughter, to like go stay with her godparents for a week. I'm going to try to mix it up, right? And try to kind of forge new relationships with people. I'm going to try to meet people more. I'm going to try to collectivize more thinking. I'm going to get more people involved in more projects. That's my answer for the future. Yeah, I mean, precisely. As soon as you get a family home, whether you have a subprime mortgage or not, you start worrying more about money than you ever did before. That's a fact. I mean, I worry more about money every year than I did the year before. And I make more money every year than I did the year before. That can't be the goal. Which is to say we've been tricked into thinking that a lot of how we measure success is a trick. I mean, I'm not the first person to say this, surely. But what it does to architecture is particularly ugly. Indeed, that everybody has to have like their single family home, that you have to have all these symbols, right? And instead of having something much cooler, right? Or just let's even step back, like renting totally works. I mean, in a lot of ways, I mean, Germans, I mean, they're great facts. Like there's an inverse relationship between renting and owning between the UK and Germany, right? So something like a third of Germans own their houses and 2/3 rent, and something like 2/3 of Brits own their houses and 1/3 rents, right? And one of the simple things that comes out of that is that British houses are getting smaller much, much faster than German houses, right? Because people want a piece of the pie and the market figured that out, and there's just endless downward pressure on it because they're selling that dream, right? And I'm not arguing for bigger houses or smaller houses, but in theory, that seems weird. And like if you look at funny things like John Lewis, which is a kind of department store in England, like they also started making the beds smaller in England. And here in Germany, the beds get bigger. People get bigger and bigger beds, and in England they get smaller and smaller beds. Partly due to this like owning, renting mismatch. That was a bit of a long-winded that was like a complicated thing that I just tried to say. I hope that was clear.
I'm just going to take a look on my computer here and see if we have any questions coming in. So first one here about your teaching or crits at school. What do you notice about this generation of students? Do you think they're interested in collectivity?
I think they are interested in collectivity, particularly they're all incredibly lonely right at this very moment. So it's particularly because of this COVID situation, they're all alone. And so we're having, my entire life is on Zoom calls, not dissimilar from what we're doing now, with students who are increasingly interested in being together. But that's of course true also before, but now I think that students really imagine living together, and the idea of kind of real estate in a business sense feels very, very far away to them. Mm-hmm. And they're in London, so I'm teaching at the AA, where everybody shares and everybody has to do that. And so by their very nature, all of the projects that we're doing are about combining living with something else, with working, with interacting. So it becomes collective. I have hope for the students.
Great. Let's see what else we have here. Okay, interesting. Should architects make projects or work on policies?
I make projects and they should work on policies. I really think that the projects still kind of address my own vanity, even though it's about collectivity in many ways. And I'd love to figure out how to turn that into policy, but I haven't yet. But I think policy is more important.
Okay, let's see if we can squeeze in another question or two. Coming in from the chat, you spoke on the countryside. Do you see urban populations becoming more sensitive to the countryside without suburbanizing or appropriating them in the post-COVID world?
I hope so, because I think we need more flexibility. And I think we need a better answer than Rem's last answer.
All right, let's see if we have time for one more. Another question from the audience. Can you differentiate your idea of collectivity and a commune?
It's hard, but it's really important to make that difference. So communes, you get into aesthetic things, and you can talk for hours about this, but communes involve a kind of anti-luxury concept. And I really want to sell the idea that whoever you want to be can be collective, right? So communes to me have all kinds of ideology potentially built into them. And collectivity doesn't per se have to have any ideology. Not that I don't have ideologies, and not that you don't have ideologies, whoever asked that question, but just to say that whatever it is that you want to achieve doesn't have to be, you don't have to relate those two things. So in everybody's mind, like somehow when you hear commune, means like you have to do the chores, right? And that's not, that's fine. You can also do the chores. I'm not anti-chores. I'm just anti-saying or siloing collectivity into a kind of lifestyle that commune seems to bring up, which of course is an artificial semantic logic, but still it's true.
All right, great. Well, thank you so much for that answer. I'm afraid we have to wrap up now. Thank you once again for joining us, Sam, everyone in the audience who's here. Sam, of course, we hope we'll get the chance to talk with you more about these topics in the future. And next up, we have Eric Klinenberg, who will be joining us from New York.
Thanks a lot.
One of the most remarkable features of the world we live in today is that for the first time in all of human history, there are enormous numbers of people who are living alone for long periods of time. Literally in the 200,000 year history of our species, we have not had this. And starting in the second part of the 20th century, great numbers of people in affluent nations around the world started settling down home alone. And so there's been this tremendous spike in one-person households. It's especially prominent in cities. It's more of an urban phenomenon than a rural or suburban one. And you see it at especially high rates in nations that have both a kind of booming market economy, but also a lot of social protections that allow people to live at home and also get the kind of basic support they need to get by. There's a lot of confusion in public conversations about living alone and being isolated and feeling lonely. And often we conflate those concepts. And the truth is that many people who live alone are very active socially, do not really struggle with loneliness any more than other people, if at all. And many people who live with others, including people who are in long-term marriages struggle with loneliness. And so it's a mistake to conflate those concepts. To live alone is not to feel lonely, and to be married or to live with others is not to escape the problems of loneliness altogether either. But often, living alone is one of these conditions that is very mixed. It gives you the kind of possibility for autonomy, but makes it much harder to get the social contact and intimacy that many people need. And so, if you do live alone, you have to work very hard to assemble your social life. And some people do that very well, and other people struggle with it. And right now, as we live through this coronavirus pandemic, a lot of people who lived alone and maintained a pretty busy and active social life in public places are really struggling with the feeling of being isolated and lonely and cut off from forms of collective life that they depended on. So I think there'll be a real reckoning at the end of this event, and people will have to ask themselves, what works best. One of the real advances in public health over the last decade or two is we've come to recognize just how dangerous loneliness can be if it's allowed to go out of control. And so there's a kind of healthy loneliness, which is your body's physiological cue to you that you need to get off your couch and engage friends and relatives, be in the social world. A little bit of loneliness is your body telling you need stronger connections, and there's a variety of ways you can get those. But when loneliness, is unaddressed and you can't get those connections, it can cycle into something much worse. And so I think we know much more than we used to about how damaging loneliness can be on people and how important it is to address it. And so, a lot of governments around the world are starting to take it more seriously as a public health concern. One of the real advances in public health over the last decade or two is we've come to recognize just how dangerous loneliness can be if it's allowed to go out of control. And so there's a kind of healthy loneliness, which is your body's physiological cue to you that you need to get off your couch and engage friends and relatives, be in the social world. A little bit of loneliness is your body telling you need stronger connections, and there's a variety of ways you can get those. But when loneliness, is unaddressed and you can't get those connections, it can cycle into something much worse. And so I think we know much more than we used to about how damaging loneliness can be on people and how important it is to address it. And so, a lot of governments around the world are starting to take it more seriously as a public health concern. Obviously, in England, they have a commissioner whose job is to manage loneliness, and the former Surgeon General of the United States has been calling attention to loneliness in his work as well. I think that's a fine development. I just say that oftentimes the reports that we have reached record levels of loneliness or epidemic levels of loneliness seem to me unpersuasive. You just don't have the evidence that there's that much more loneliness today than there used to be. There's mixed evidence. And so I have no real concerns about kind of special programs to deal with loneliness. I just think they should be placed in the context of other kinds of public health threats that we experience. I've been an advocate for building more social infrastructure in our cities and communities. And by social infrastructure, I'm referring to the physical places and the organizations that shape our capacity to interact with each other. So if you're part of a city or a suburb or a town that invests in public libraries or parks or playgrounds or commercial corridors that invite people to come together, senior citizen centers, these kinds of activities, and these physical places host activities that really allow us to build bridges to the people around us. And they don't solve the loneliness problem, but if you live in a community that has a great playground or a great library or a great park, you have so many more opportunities to be in the world with the people who live around you, that I think that can make a real difference in our quality of life and in our capacity to overcome the feeling that we're on our own. When the pandemic first got started, there were a lot of health officials who were calling for social distancing as a strategy for getting through this crisis. And I understood why they use that concept, but immediately I got very concerned about it because social distancing tells us that what we need to do is to get into our home and close the door and turn our backs on the world, just take care of ourselves. Inevitably, at a moment like this, there's some people and places are going to need a lot of support. Instead of our backs, what they really need is a helping hand. And so it occurred to me that it's not actually social proximity or social distance that determines whether you expose someone else to a contagious virus. It's physical distance. And in fact, what we really need to get through this situation is social solidarity. We need to be recognizing the ways in which we're interdependent, to recognize the ways in which our fate is linked to the fate of our neighbors, the people around us, and to make sure we're investing in public strategies, public goods that promote the best in all of us. And if we can't do that, we just make each one of ourselves more vulnerable, more dangerous. And so the way I've been thinking about this moment is it's not social distancing that we need, it's physical distancing and social solidarity. My message for designers at this moment is that this is kind of an extraordinary moment. I mean, everything is up for grabs. We are going to embark on massive new building projects in coming years. We are going to be rethinking a bunch of the fundamental questions about what it is to live in a city, what it is to organize a metropolitan region, how to design public spaces, what's the right level of kind of intimacy and distance that we need to live together. And my belief, based on work I've done for years now, is that over time, our anxiety about touching and closeness will fade, and that we will come back with very strong interest in being close, and we should be thinking about design of our physical places for the future as being organized around that same challenge. How do you make beautiful physical places where people can be together? Because that's really what we want. The most inspiring things at this moment are the acts of mutual assistance that you see at the very local level, the calls for rebuilding our appreciation of the public good, of our common interests, of our democratic institutions. I think there are a lot of people who recognize that historically crises like this have been pivot points for societies, and they create real possibilities for doing something new and different. And look, let's face it, we were pretty divided long before the coronavirus came around, and many of us feared the future of our democratic institutions before this moment arrived. And so, I see people looking for ways to help their older neighbors and relatives learn technology so that they can stay connected during this moment. I've seen younger people who get criticized in public often for going to parties and staying in the world, but who in fact, in the great majority of cases, are out there finding ways to help each other and to help older people. So I've seen people making deliveries of food and medical supplies and other essential goods to neighbors who could really use that assistance. There are all kinds of good signs out there, and unfortunately there are a lot of things pushing in the opposite direction as well, because people always try to exploit disasters for their own advantage, and once again, we've seen profiteering, we've seen corruption and use of government funds for people who don't need it. And I think in the coming months and years, there's going to be massive fighting over what kind of future we build.
So let's start right away with the Q&A. We have one first question from Veronica, who asks, do you think technology plays a role in loneliness today?
It's a big debate. Is Facebook making us lonelier than we've ever been? Have we reached this situation where we're on our screens so much that we've failed to make real deep connections with the people around us? I think, to be honest, there's just not great evidence that technology is making us lonelier than we've ever been. I think there are some people who really don't use technology well, and they tend to compare their own lives to the fantasy lives of people whose stories they track on social media, and they wind up feeling bad about themselves and feeling lonely. But I mean, here we are in this moment where, were it not for technology like the Zoom that we're all on right now, or FaceTime or Skype, or Facebook or Twitter for that matter, we'd just be much more isolated and disconnected than we'd otherwise be. So I think the answer, unfortunately, is it depends. But I don't believe that technology is making us lonelier than we've ever been.
Our next question asks, in relation to George Simmel, how he argued that isolation is something that was derived from modern life in cities. And the question is, do you think that this current interruption of modern life and life in the fast lane could contribute to a more positive way of people participating in public life?
Wow, well, hats off to you for bringing up Simmel in this conversation. I hadn't prepared for it, but it's true. He's one of my heroes in sociology. George Simmel is an inspiring figure who had probably the most profound things to say about the role of the individual in society. And I do think that this has been a very scary period for so many of us. I mean, it's been very difficult to deal with our anxieties, with our losses, with our illnesses. But that said, if you've been able to get through this period and have some productive solitude and think about the kind of life you want to be living, about the relationships that you want to have, about how you might change the pace of your life and your interactions, your relationship to your screen, but also to other people when you come back into the world, you know, this could be a productive time. I have been a big believer in the idea that this event could be a switching point in history. It could take us to a very dark place, but there is a real possibility that we get out of this with a new sense of how to live better and a renewed spirit of solidarity. And I'm hoping for that.
On a similar note, someone asks, in regards to the terrible urban unrest we're seeing right now and police violence around the world, but especially in the US, is there a role that social infrastructure is playing or can play?
Well, I think yes. I mean, if we didn't have social infrastructure like sidewalks and streets and public plazas, people could not assemble to protest a repressive and violent and abusive government. People could not express their frustration with racism, with racial inequality and racial violence. And I think there's been a lot of pent up anger about what's been happening in my country, for a long time, and also during the COVID crisis when people of color, Black and Latino people especially, have fared so much worse than white people. And I'm grateful that we have social infrastructure to sustain the movement that we really need to get to a better place.
You've spoken about social infrastructure as both being programmed spaces or unprogrammed spaces. Is there a role for both that are different, or is one more effective than the other?
There's definitely a role for both. I mean, the library, which is one of my favorite social infrastructures, is a heavily programmed space. The rooms are designed to be programmed in a particular way. And then they have programmers in the shape of librarians who help to guide activity. We're at a time right now where programming and programmers really help, because we need to be out in public, but also maintain physical distance to stay safe during this pandemic. But when it's over, there's also really a role for unplanned, unprogrammed public spaces that people can adapt for their own uses. And parks are great for that, for instance, and sidewalks and streets can do that too. So there really is a need for a mix of those things. I think we tend to take program spaces for granted, and I think we really need to recognize just what value we get from a program public space as well.
Great, that's all the time we have. Thank you again for your time, and thanks to everyone who asked questions.
Thank you very much. It's been great to be with you.
Hello, everyone. I'm Greg Lynn, a huge fan and supporter of the CCA, and recently joined their board. And I was asked about having a conversation with someone, and the first person I thought of instantly was Nicholas Negroponte. And I'm so happy that Nicholas can join us and talk to us a little bit about not so much where we're at, but where we might be going. And so thank you, Nicholas, and looking forward to having a great conversation. I think to kick this thing off, one of the things when I first got to know you, what I was the most struck by was that you said you were used to working on big problems with design and technology. And I'm feeling right now that design and technology together are being looked to solve big problems all of a sudden again. And I'm wondering if you're feeling that too, and what you think some of the big problems are. And I don't mean just with COVID, I mean with the climate, just with everything.
Let me start with a little background, because you might remember I went to architecture school and I studied architecture like you did, and like probably a lot of people in the audience. And when I came close to finishing my degree, I felt that the impact that I might have in the rest of my life might be very small unless I was one out of 100,000 who were sort of Frank Gehry-like, that had enormous impact, not only in specific buildings, but ways of thinking and so on. So that maybe instead of going into architecture, I could go into making the tools for architects. That's where I started. And you make a trade-off. You don't get credit as a tool maker, but inside, you know, you're going to have a bigger impact because many people will use your tools to do many things. And if you can embed things in those tools, that could be really impactful. So that's what I spent my life doing. I got slightly distracted because I didn't like the tools, and then you make better tools, and then you get into, you know the story. You go down a rabbit hole. But one thing that we always enjoyed, particularly at MIT, is that because there weren't economic pressures on sort of, you did something for a client or you did something for a sponsor, it was much more free rein thinking. You could think about big things. And I had colleagues who were doing that. And I'll name people like Marvin Minsky. And while I didn't know Buckminster Fuller particularly well, I had him as a professor. That's how old I am. And, you know, those people, they were big thinkers. They were really big thinkers. And now the conversation that you're referring to, I've become a little worried that the current startup economy, the current lockdown on ideas by big companies, the secrecy has made the big idea thinking a little smaller. Smaller, not just because people have smaller ideas, but there are less of them doing it. It breaks my heart to see some large number of our students go off and do startup companies that are delivering each other pizza or making, or dealing with laundry or something. These are sucking people out of what I would have expected to be much bigger thinking.
I mean, one of the things that I've heard from everybody is that people are hitting pause right now and asking larger questions. I would say, I think I told you, I was very fascinated with some of the things that WeWork was doing in terms of building an intelligent space. But I always found that it was like a Tyson chicken farm where they were just trying to figure out how to pack people in a tighter and tighter volume and have them turn faster and faster, so that it was amazing technology and ambition, but for, again, optimization in a way rather than doing something liberating. Whereas now everybody's saying, what's an office anyway? Let's stop for a minute and ask ourselves, like, what are we talking about here? Like, if I'm going to have to work out of my house isn't a house anymore, or my apartment's not an apartment anymore. And I have to rethink what my office is if it's not a bunch of conference rooms and, and cubbies.
Well, also, the coronavirus has forced people to do things that then they step back and they say, wait a moment, that's not so bad. Is, for example, going to an office really that important? And the answer is, more often than not, no. Because what are you doing? You're typing at home. All of us work at home in some degree. And then what do? You go to office and you shut the door and you log back into another machine. You just continue to do what you were doing at home. So the actual benefit is small. And one of the biggest technologies in terms of impacting architecture and impacting cities is the elevator. And nobody wants to get into an elevator anymore. Can you imagine getting into an elevator? I mean, the idea is so, at this moment, just so outside my scope. I said, well, wait a second, what would a city without elevators mean? Well, it's a different kind of city, and it could be, there could be inventions that change what we took for granted early. People going up and down at the same time in little boxes.
One of the things that I love designing something that's a prototype, just because there's the assumption that it's going to be for some form of collective adoption and use rather than for like one person or a couple or a family or something. It's much more fun to design things that are prototypical. How do you feel? Where is the temperature right now? Is it more on prototypes? I mean, do you think big problems are associated with prototypical thinking and thinking about the collective rather than the individual?
Well, there's sort of two questions there. Thinking about the collective has gone a little out of style in this country, partly because of the current administration, and maybe there's been 20 or 30 years that we've told our children, sweetheart, you should, go into business and do well. Yeah. There has not been much of a sense of civics. When I grew up, my father made it clear that the best thing that any of us could ever do was to go into some form of civil service, and that civic society, that if you actually contributed to that, that was really the right thing to do. And this was kind of a rich person's view, because there's no need for anybody to sort of worry about where the next meal's coming from. So instead, it's your obligation. It's what you should be doing. There's usually the assumption that the public sector is for losers and the winners go into the private sector. And that's a very sad state of affairs. And, architects have lived on both sides of that equation, because some architecture is done at both a civic scale and as part of civic society. And, some architects have done it as a vocation, and they as well as they need to do, or as they want to do. But the world in general right now has got to change, and I don't mean just the coming election.
It really feels like people look out for themselves first and look out for other people later, and it doesn't actually work that way. And that's more apparent than ever right now. I think there's a real focus, at least in our household, that we had a big debate about using Instacart. And the first day we decided to use Instacart, I was really concerned, and the Instacart person came, and it was a 70-some-year-old woman. And we said, oh my gosh, like, why are you delivering Instacart? And she said, because I get early access to the grocery stores. So everybody doing Instacart now is over 65 because they're the first ones in. And it's just the focusing on ourselves and not thinking about the consequences. It's just so visible right now that hopefully people pay more attention to the cost of thinking selfishly.
Well, the top of my list is unfettered capitalism. I hope it does not come back. And I hope there's, a rethinking, because you can look at different areas where that just got us into trouble. And it's the unfettered part that is the important part. It's not a complete dismissal of competition and, all that goes with that.
Yeah, I feel like I'm not quite ready to say it, but a lot of the sharing economy, which sounds such a good thing. Like, I mean, when your kids are 4, you say, you need to learn to share your toys. Sounds good, but the reality of it, I think, is very, very dark. And it's definitely under question right now. People are not so sure they want to get into somebody's car and have them drive them around. They're not so sure. There's a lot of things that we should share and need and that really feel like a huge loss, like public transportation is in a bad spot right now. But certain shared models, I think, were very exploitive. And I would, about a third of them, I would be happy if they don't bounce back.
That's pretty gutsy.
Really? I know you well enough to know you disagree with that.
No, not at all.
Okay.
No. I think that's a very bold prediction, because the shared economy, as it came to be known, was built on the premise that, the duty cycle of so many things around us is so low. Why own a car? In fact, owning a car is sort of a stupid, certainly in a city, nobody owns a car, really.
Yep.
Except maybe Los Angeles. But, so I was very favorable to the sharing economy. And even though I don't want people living in my house, it does bother me that I have an empty house sitting in Cambridge, or that there's, stuff. You think, well, maybe we should share that. Maybe that, but certainly conserves energy and has other properties. But if you think that a third of those will bite the dust, that's pretty interesting.
Yeah, for me, it's much more, my teenage son would have 6-bird scooters in the house every night charging. And we would see them, in the street getting demolished, or also in the street not getting used. And the kind of, that everybody wants a service with no responsibility is the part that I won't miss if it disappears. I mean, responsibility for objects and responsibility for things, and not just assuming that you call something up on your phone and it arrives 2 seconds later, delivered by somebody who doesn't even really have a full-time job. That part of the sharing economy I wouldn't miss if it was slightly curtailed, only because I don't know where it stops. It's either going to be accelerated or it's going to be curtailed, or else, some aspects are going to survive and some won't. But there's definitely a reckoning on sharing right now.
is Hazel Grover from St. Paul, Minnesota, and the thing about my family that I don't want to go back to normal is trust. It feels that too often on a normal schedule, I'm not trusted to handle simple tasks without a million reminders, but now that school gives us tasks and we are expected to do them, I feel my parents' trust in me has increased as they see that I can get things done.
My name is Amali and I'm from New York City. During quarantine, I have had a lot of free time. During this time, I'm able to spend more quality time with my parents and improve my room. My dad and I have been going on many bike rides, and my mom and I just started jogging together. We have also been playing a lot of board games. When I'm not at school or doing my homework or spending time with my family, I've been working to improve my room. So far, I've installed a photo wall and rearranged my furniture. When the pandemic is over, I really hope I can still spend this time with my family and I continue to improve my room.
Hi, my name is Lauren McDonald, and I live in Oakville, Ontario, Canada. I don't want to lose the flexibility of how I use my time to change after the pandemic. I love being able to do schoolwork on my own schedule, and I love all my family time, enjoying the garden, board games, and relaxing together.
My name is Ina Udir, and I come from Zagreb, Croatia. When I first read your question, I thought about people going outside. I don't think I've ever seen so many children playing in the street I live in, nor have I ever seen so many cyclists. It is something I would like to see every day, since it is good not only for the environment, but for the individuals themselves. Many people have resorted to alternative methods of transportation because my city was recently struck with an earthquake, rendering many of the usual transportation means, such as trams or buses, completely useless in certain parts of the city where the rubble is blocking the streets. Another thing I would like to mention, even though I know it doesn't pertain to my city as much as it does to, for example, Venice, is ecology. Separating man from nature has led to some great improvements in the environment. And I know this is only temporary because major factories aren't working, but I think it is a great wake-up call for us to start caring more about the environment. It certainly made me think about what I can do to help my community and to initiate positive change.
Hello, I'm Lev Bertoshenko, Curator Public at CCA, and you just heard from some of the teens selected for our new project, Is There an Expert in the Room, aged 13 to 16. Now, we've done many research projects over the past 40 years, but this is the first where the teenagers are the experts. It began as a reflection last year, before the crisis, when we were asking ourselves, what are some experts we are maybe overlooking, some of the best people we should be talking to for some of our current interests. And as the parents among you will know, teens are sophisticated negotiators of shared space, right? They're at this point in their lives when they're kind of beginning to establish their independence, but they can't leave home. And this is an interesting condition. So this generation is special in other ways. They've basically been online since birth. Their social lives are totally networked. And they've also been educated with a really deep awareness of climate fragility and their own role, their own complicity in producing it. So it's really no accident that it's this generation that's produced Greta Thunberg. They're systems thinkers, critical thinkers, and at the same time, they know they're engaged in a kind of individualistic consumer society. So you could say they're the furthest future that we can talk to today. And we're really looking forward to speaking with them over the summer, and stay tuned to see what we'll produce.